Hello and welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your host for this edition, Eric Tait, and my guest for this particular session is Kevin McGrew. Did I get that correct, Kevin?
Yes, you did, Eric.
All right, good. Folks, we're probably going to not touch on too many different issues because there's one main topic that we're primarily interested in, but we know what's going on in the top of the news when this airs on Monday. We'll be getting fallout from the terrorist movement that's going on, terrorist activity that's going on, and counter-terrorist activity that's going on in Paris, France. And hopefully they may come to some better resolution than we've had thus far. From what I can tell, we still have some suspects at large.
Yes, that's what I was listening to today and noticing that the two suspects are still at large, and the police believe they're outside of France, outside of Paris at this time.
By now. A couple of the things, of course, always concerns us is when folks, basically, when these things occur, we have the problem of basically folks conflating Islam, Islamists, and Muslims with terrorists and terrorism. And so there have been some online discussion about people rushing to judgment and just blanket blaming all Muslims for this kind of an attack, but hopefully cooler heads will prevail.
It would be nice. The thing that seems to be consistent is you usually have poor people or people that come from certain backgrounds, and it's easy to attack a group. You have terrorists that came from England, terrorists that came from Scotland, and terrorists that came from Northern Ireland, and it had nothing to do with a religion or anything. So
we have our own homegrown terrorists right here in this country, usually referred to as the KKK or the Knights of the Chameleon. I know historically from the work that I've done that basically is a terrorist organization, has a history of terrorism, and the folks they were terrorizing is us. And guess what? Most of those crosses that they were burning were crosses professing their, quote, Christian faith. So,
absolutely.
So you cannot claim that terrorists reside in any one religion. So
absolutely not. The Ku Klux Klan is, in my best estimation, the epitome of terrorism. They've terrorized this country and continue to attempt to terrorize. I was reading the other day where a gentleman was upset that the police officers in New York City were killed, and he said the Ku Klux Klan is not dead. We will take a stand to protect our police. And it's like, is this terrorist organization? I thought they had gone into hiding, but it seems that they're feeling their oats.
I don't think they've ever gone into hiding. They've waxed and waned, as the saying goes.
Absolutely,
but they've never gone away. And folks tend to try to forget their actual reason for being, and which was basically to terrorize black people. That
Absolutely.
was their reason for being. But the other issue, of course, when we deal with Media Watch is how good, bad, or indifferent the coverage is. And for stories, breaking stories like the events in Europe and in Paris, people are always rushing to try to get new breaks on their stories. And of course, NBC News fell into the trap of relying on, quote, government, U.S. government, counter-terrorist experts to talk about supposedly one suspect being killed, one being captured, et cetera, et cetera. It turned out, of course, that instead of relying on their own underground reporters and or sources and or stringers, they were relying on, quote, government experts, and they got the wrong information.
And it was a smack in the face for NBC News. I'm glad they got it right after a while, but
the rush to judgment,
absolutely.
The rush to be first, we always have to worry about that. So, but I want to double back to an issue you raised about somebody being upset about those two New York City police officers that were assassinated, and I use the word judiciously because that's an exact definition of what happened. People
Correct.
keep saying they got ambushed. They didn't get ambushed. They were sitting out in plain sight.
Right.
Nobody did any hiding to jump on them. They were out in plain sight. This individual, deranged individual, walked up to them in plain sight, did not ambush them, but he actually assassinated, he executed them.
Correct.
And we've been, on this show, we talk about two wrongs not making a right ever. And when we deal with whether it's international news like what's going on in Palestine with the Israelis and the Palestinians, two wrongs never make a right there. When we deal with bad cops doing their policing here, which we have a plenitude of evidence of bad cops doing bad policing, not just in New York City, but for someone to walk up and decide he's going to take matters into his own hands like this gentleman did, first of all, those officers were trying to fulfill whatever their job was to the best of their ability. And the irony of it is he chose two examples of New York City police officers who actually turned out to be fine examples of individuals who actually tried their best to fulfill, protect, and serve. Those two examples were phenomenal.
Absolutely. These two officers were sitting there doing their job. As a retired law enforcement officer myself, I know what it's like to go to work and to be concerned about coming home every day. And I feel for these officers that, these two individuals had no intention of this being their last day, nor did they do anything to bring this on them. So it was an assassination. And as you say, the deranged individual that did it, it was a smack in the face of everything that everyone was trying to stand for. I don't believe that the connections between him and any movement is justified. I think the individual was deranged. He obviously he shot his girlfriend prior to coming to New York. He rode the bus. He sent text prior to coming to New York, and then he made an outrageous statement. These officers were assassinated by him, and he also his actions put a dampening on a movement that had nothing to do with him. So in one swift stroke, he managed to undo a lot of things, not only their lives, but the movement that was trying to correct the wrongs that definitely happen in law enforcement.
I'm glad you raised that issue because that's part of a lot of what I'd like to discuss with you. Give our viewing audience a little bit of your law enforcement background because you are retired. You've been in that system for, tell us how many years, tell them where you were.
I'm a retired correction officer, captain from Westchester County. I used to run a prison. I did that for 24 and a half years prior to retiring. Upon my retirement, I'd been assaulted on several occasions. It's strange that people occasionally look at correction officers as the B team of law enforcement. We're used to that. But if you consider the fact that every single day I walk into a room with 30 to 40 people who I know have weapons, they all have weapons, and I have nothing. And I walk into this building, I let them lock a gate behind me, and I'm locked in with them. So in that environment, you feel the dangers, so I empathize with the officers. I also know that in that environment, just like in the police in the streets or the deputy sheriffs, the officers with the least experience get the worst neighborhoods or the most difficult jobs.
That's a point that's worth definitely emphasizing. What we're saying is the younger, more inexperienced, less seasoned law enforcement individuals end up, by dint of their lack of service, getting what I would call the short shrift, being put into the tougher, rougher neighborhoods.
Yes, with seniority comes the better jobs. They have names for them, but we want the good jobs. If I've been here 10 or 15 years, I don't want to have to go and run up and down the stairs in the projects. So I want to sit in Times Square, or maybe not even in Times Square. I want to sit in a nice neighborhood. I want to go to Riverdale. I want to sit in a calm area in Queens. I don't want to sit in bad neighborhoods. to sit in Midtown Manhattan or Uptown,
So
or you know.
your precincts, your less traumatized precincts, so the way of phrasing it,
Correct.
are the more cushy jobs, and
Absolutely.
the more senior people end up there.
Absolutely.
That's good to know, because it sort of jives with what, as a journalist, I've observed in covering all kinds of stories, nationally, internationally. When you talk about seasoned individual knowing how to respond and how to act, it gets to the fact that an experienced officer can pretty much judge who is really a threat on the streets much better than a rookie.
Absolutely. With most officers who have experience, they look at rookie officers and say a rookie is going to get them in trouble because they're going to make mistakes. They don't have the seasoning. They see a situation that can be calmed with interpersonal communication skills. I could walk up to a guy and not to second guess or not to bring this up, but in the Eric Garner case, it appeared to me to be a situation where you could have spoken to him and Eric, calm down. What's the problem? It seems that it could have been handled in a completely different way than going from 0 to 100 immediately.
Good point, and you raise that, and I'm glad you raised it, because here's my take on something like that. If you look at the makeup of all the police officers that surrounded Eric Garner, there may have been one female in there. I think she may have been Hispanic. She may have been white. The lead officer that I saw, he was white, and this is in the video.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the actual report said to the breakdown, but just looking at the video. And the black face in that sea of faces was Eric Garner.
Correct.
And so what I have experienced, and what most black individuals experience, is that the police officers that police our neighborhood don't look at us as individuals. They look at us as guilty until proven innocent, which stop and frisk, broken windows, you name it, whatever they want to call it. The bottom line is they come into our community not as a protect and serve mentality, not with a protect and serve mentality, but with a I am going to bring you down as quickly as possible and make sure I get home safe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe you're absolutely right. I believe more to that point, if you put a person in a uniform, you give him a tank, you tell him he's fighting a war, and you don't identify the enemies, and then you put him in what you call a war zone, who is the enemy? It's everyone. And he's viewing the people in these neighborhoods, in my neighborhood, as we are the enemy. And because I've grown up in this neighborhood and I understand completely. I mean, I understand completely there is crime. Most people in my community want the police there. We like the police there. We like the police to protect us. We understand that. The problem is we have to give up so much to get that protection.
Let's talk about that. You say we have to give up so much to get that protection. That goes to the heart of the matter, in that in our communities, as I see it and as I felt it, we don't walk with the presumption that we're walking as innocents with full protection of the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Bill of Rights, constitutional protections that most people have in their neighborhoods. We walk with, and we tell our young black men and young black women that they have to be very careful of the police. As a matter of fact, you related an anecdote to me about a month ago. Share it with us about those kids who were walking down the street.
Oh, yeah.
What was going on?
The other day I was walking down the street and I was getting out of my car and I saw some teenagers. They were coming out of school and they started to kick cars and jump on cars and, really act rowdy. Young kids, they were out of control. And I considered calling the police. But prior to making that phone call, I had to consider the fact that if I call the police, what could happen? The police could come, the kids could get out of control, and one of these children die. And these were kids. They were acting silly. They were acting stupid, of course. I don't say what they were doing was right. But they were acting like kids.
Of course it wasn't right.
It wasn't right. It was childish and silly.
And because they were bordering on vandalism, you actually considered calling the police,
Absolutely.
which would be a normal reaction in a normal community. were we in a different relationship with our local police?
If I was if it was a different relationship in a different neighborhood, of course I would have called the police. But I believe the police would have come heavy-handed. Kids could have run. A police officer may have thought one of these kids was reaching for a weapon when he was actually going for a cell phone, and then there would be a dead kid there. And it was just something that I thought it was a strange moment in my life, because it was the first time I had that thought. Like, wow, should I make this phone call?
There we go. That's what bothers me about this, because I've been a journalist over 45 years. And over the years, I've seen enough stories come across my desk. I've sent enough people out on stories. I've read enough police blotter stuff to come to the conclusion, as objectively as possible, that our police departments that used to be more protect and serve when I was a kid growing up in Harlem, and it wasn't that great when I was a kid growing up in Harlem, but at least it was a sense of, as some people said, those cops walked the block and they actually knew the store owners, they knew most of the people in the precinct that they police, to today, where they tend to be not only more SWAT-minded, more militarized with the tanks and the armored vehicles and all that stuff, but they are more trigger happy. That is the phrase that people used to use way back when they were talking about gangsters. I feel that our police departments across the country, not New York City, are trigger happy. They shoot before they talk.
I've noticed this shift. It is a shift that has changed in corrections. When I started in corrections ages ago, 34 years ago, 35 years ago, I started in corrections, and it was a different animal. We had smaller amounts of prisoners, for one thing, but I mean the activities were different in prison. Now in prison, there are cameras. Officers can't do things. There are rules. If you have a use of force, you have to fill out a documentation saying you have to document why you used it, the amount of force that was necessary, and it needs to be consistent with what is on camera. We're aware it's on camera. We're aware that this use of force documentation is there. There is a board in Albany that looks at what you do. And guess what? It still works. There are reforms, and reforms work. Police departments need reforms across the board. The police have become happy or comfortable with shooting their weapons. The amount of people that are shot in America is ridiculous by police. Now, I do understand there's a huge argument in this that I hear all the time about black on black crime. Forgive me for sounding facetious but I really don't understand that. I mean, if it's black on black crime, should the criminal not commit a crime against another black person, or should they not commit a crime? And if they shouldn't commit a crime, then the race of the criminal and the race of the victim should be irrelevant. I think the black on black crime is an ultimate distraction. I think and not to bring a bad situation or a sad thing, but when the guy went into Newtown and killed those little kids, no one cried white on white crime. It wasn't an issue.
Nobody ever cries white on white crime when shootings occur and things
like that.
There's
never a white on white crime thing.
That's not a phrase anybody uses.
I know, and no one. I've never heard a reporter or anyone say, white people need to stop killing white people. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Here's the statistic that the criminal justice experts, who sometimes actually know what they're talking about, use when they talk about why stop and frisk was such a bad policing tactic. And they made references to a number of other large cities that had decided that they weren't going to do just blanket profiling of people by race and color and economic status. They were doing it by the fact that their statistic proved that within any given high crime area, whether it's a white neighborhood, black neighborhood, brown neighborhood, somewhere between 1.5 to 2% of the people within that square are the ones committing the crime. And other people in that neighborhood, wherever they are usually the victims. They're not. But because those 1.2%, 2% individuals look like the people they're preying on, so they use a stop and frisk policy to profile everybody that lives in that neighborhood. Well, guess what? You turn off all the residents who you really need to help you stop the 1.5%.
There's and I keep going back to corrections. There is there's a mantra in corrections. You can't have freedom and security. They both can't. They're not mutually exclusive. You have to give up one to get another. I hear talking a balance. There's no balance. If you give, the only way to get more of one is to give up more of the other. That's the only way to balance it. So the tighter the security, the less freedom
within the correctional system.
What I have found out is in corrections, for instance, there are people who are willing to freely give up all of their freedoms for the illusion or for the feeling of security. There are people that would walk to me when I was a captain and say, "Captain," or that the sergeant would bring it to me, or "Captain, I want to be put in protective custody." Protective custody consisted of being locked in 23 hours a day. He would be willing to be locked in his cell 23 hours a day just because he was afraid something would happen. Mm-hmm. And he was happy with this. Mm-hmm. And I get afraid that people are forgetting in a free society, we can't give everything away.
That's an analogy that actually is worth exploring, in that what you're saying is people want to give up their freedoms just because they want to feel safe. So they'll live in a living prison in the supposed real world just so they can feel safe.
And we're not, and you're no safer. You're no safer. It's just an illusion.
I like the analogy.
We need to look at as citizens. There's the First Amendment of the Constitution speaks, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights speaks to the people's right to peaceably assemble, to ask for redress against the government for grievances. Protest.
That's right. It's a peaceful.
Now, the police departments are supposed to protect that right.
Yes.
And they don't. The police departments are so annoyed by my protest that then they protest my protest. Right. In other words, they're the only ones. And the police ultimately are the government. I mean, it's something we always forget. They're the government.
Part of the city government. Right. They're part of the state government. They're part of the federal government.
So it's the government telling the citizens, you shouldn't seek redress from the government. Only the government should be able to use this to seek redress from you. And it's amazing.
Well, I think we've got about 5 to 6 minutes left. What's your take, basically, on this particular development with the New York City Police Department, primarily actually the Patrolman Benevolent, quote, Benevolent Association, and their lack of respect for the mayor of the city of New York, because he has expressed certain reservations about how they've been performing their job?
It's interesting you brought that up. I was speaking to someone, an officer, a police officer on the way down, and I was asking him, and he voiced his opinion. There's a faction in the police department that is the Policemen's Benevolent Association that is showing absolute disrespect. While they're in uniform, they are employees and they are agents of the government, officials of the government. A paramilitary organization has to respect the civilian government. They just have to respect the civilian leadership. If you looked at it as the military, if the generals decided they didn't like what, the country would be panicked. This disrespect for the mayor is a disrespect for everyone. He was democratically elected, and if we don't like him, we can get him out on the next election. Mm-hmm. He was democratically elected by 74% of the city. Interesting number, because approximately 74% of the police department don't live in the city. Yeah. So they didn't vote for him. They have no input. And You know what they used to say to me when I was a kid? I'm sure you've heard this. If you don't vote, don't talk. And they didn't vote, so stop talking. This is my mayor. If I voted for him, I am speaking. I spoke with my vote. Speak with your vote.
Yeah, I think, 2 minutes, so? Bottom line is, when I was in the military, there was a fast rule that you had to respect the office, even if you didn't respect the office holder per se. And so if you didn't respect your commander-in-chief, you still had to respect the fact that he was in that office.
Yes.
And so the one thing that I didn't do was disrespect the commander-in-chief. I had a chance to not shake Richard Nixon's hand publicly.
Yes.
But I made sure I shook his hand just because he was the president, and I had to respect the office that he held, even if I didn't respect the man.
I like that.
I think we got about 30 seconds.
I like that because when I was a captain, I believed freely that if the person didn't respect me, he had to respect my badge, respect my position. So I agree with you. Respect the mayor. The mayor was elected by the people. I elected him, or we elected him, and respect that.
Yeah. So I think we're about out of time, and if we're not, we're going to make ourselves out of time. This has been Media Watch, brought to you by EVT Educational Productions. And, well, maybe we can stretch a little bit more. One final thing. The fact that we have a movement that's going now to try to redress these trigger-happy cops, and not every policeman walking the beat is trigger-happy. The fact that one of the redress I think people of color should do, and I say this because I've been meaning to say it, is most folk don't respect you or your color, but they respect the color of your money. So therefore, my counsel to you folks is don't spend your money with people who don't respect you. Just make that your rule. Do that for a whole year. Spend it with people of color who respect you and appreciate you.
If we take, my grandfather used to say about the Montgomery bus boycott when I was young, he said, they love green more than they hate black. So it's that simple. If you boycott, or if you spend your money where people respect you, the people that don't respect you will start to respect you because they want your green.
That is the best message you can put out there. Action, not reaction.
Okay. Spend
your money with your folk. And so with that, Media Watch, EVT Educational Productions, and the good graces of Manhattan Neighborhood Network, I'm your host, Eric Tait. Kevin McGrew has been our guest. Kevin, thanks again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And folks, we'll catch you the next time.